If we compare it with PS4 Pro's 60Hz disabled mode then, the two are surprisingly close in most aspects, excluding of course the fact PS4 Pro peaks at 1440p. Foliage density is the same for example, however looking at this forest shot again, PS4 Pro seemingly uses a higher shadow setting than even Xbox One X. The logic is the higher the preset the clearer the outline of shade, and this does suggest Pro has an advantage. On the other hand, X is using a superior draw distance setting. Referring back to that beach scene, Pro is slightly behind on geometry LODs, but it's not a significant difference overall. Now performance is capped at 30 FPS for both these modes, and there isn't much to unstick them based on the opening chapters I've tested. Excepting a few occasional one-frame hitches, Pro and Xbox One X had in solid 30 FPS performance all the way through. Overall, I'd consider the enriched mode on Xbox One X as the best 4K experience on console. Yeah, one other thing I guess it's worth saying, the visuals are improved on X. They did do some work behind the scenes. Yeah, it's not just, you know, the performance. They just used whatever headroom was spare GPU-wise and bumped up the ambient occlusion quality. And there's also the shadows as well, which are just higher quality on the ground there. So generally speaking, it's a small touch-up. You don't get the tessellated terrain of the PC or the high quality skin maps of PC at max, which would have been nice, but you do get a small embellishment here and there.
Okay, well that's pretty cool then. So yeah, this is a cool patch overall. Very unexpected one, but this actually might be the time to give this game a shot, I suppose, if you haven't played it yet, because it's the first time we have a console version that plays the game smoothly at a solid 30 FPS with some pretty nice visuals, and most of the bugs should be fixed at this point. So I guess if you haven't played it and you're interested, this is not a bad place to jump in.
Xbox One X's playback looks visibly sharper, clearer than the PS4 Pro's image. Take this opening shot on Pro as an example. The material on the gun produces a visible noise artifact, a moire pattern resulting from an upscale. But moving to Xbox One X, all that fine detail resolves perfectly to a 4K set, with minimal scaling. It applies to the outlines of trees too, and fine cable work dangling from high up looks clearer. In every case, X passes far more convincingly on an Ultra HD display. Let's put that dynamic risk scaling into perspective next, with matching rendering loads on each machine. In this opening cutscene, Xbox One X renders at a native 4K, while on PS4 Pro we're hitting around 2816 by 1584. Moving to actual gameplay pushes the engine harder. You get 3456 by 1944 on X this time, next to the 2560 by 1440 on Pro. That's a 82% increase for Xbox One. Not trivial given the relative increase in GPU power next to Sony's hardware. As a practical example of where the two stand, this is the region we're working with, and it makes for a visible difference. Arguably the most complex scene I've found is that first tank drive in the steel on steel mission. It's again 3456 by 1944 on X here, next to 2304 by 1296 on Pro.
In a moment, but first the resolution on those other versions. So PS4 Pro, it's 1440p again, just like Hitman 2016's Pro patch. You still have the option to uncap the frame rate, which is actually something available on all versions of the game. But yeah, it's 1440. Xbox One X has both modes again, so you can either run with a native 4K or also 1440p, which is called like the performance mode basically.
So just to be clear here, the X has got selectable resolutions, 1440p and 4K, yep. And Pro is locked to 1440p. So it's in this case, it's a rerun of the first game.
That's exactly right. Same thing as we saw in the first game.
But not like the first game is performance.
Okay, so yeah, the frame rate is an interesting thing. Let's
Real attraction today is that Xbox One X support. Using a similar test, the X machine has an even higher target, pixel counts coming in at the full 3840 by 2160. This 2160p is again obscured by a thick post-process pipeline, but there's no question, the raw frame buffer is higher than Pro's.
And much like Sony's console, there is that chance Capcom is using checkerboard rendering to hit that number, but the evidence of it in motion is minimal. Again, it's really to the developer's credit that any wire work to keep these resolutions this high is effectively hidden. Xbox One X, for example, offers the cleanest image on console by far. Check out this interior shot as we drive up through the woods. This edge is rough on Pro, but completely smoothed over on Xbox One X. This applies across the game as a whole, and PS4 Pro does produce more shimmer and visual noise, especially in busy areas like this opening forest. All signs point to Microsoft's machine running equivalent to the FXAA plus TAA mode used on PC. It's extremely thorough, but judging by the ghosting artifacts behind moving edges, PS4 Pro also appears to have a temporal component. There are a few other differences to factor in. Fortunately, texture resolution, filtering quality, and even draw distance are identical between Pro and Xbox One X. The one area that is visibly improved on X hardware is in shadows. From that very first shot, PS4 Pro suffers from more stippling on dynamic shadow edges, whereas Microsoft's machine produces a clean outline all the way through. In fairness, it's not something you'd notice outside of scenes in broad daylight, but it is a plus for X owners nevertheless.
It's worth touching on visual features too, and how it compares to Sony's hardware. Now I've gone back to the PS4 Pro version fully updated in light of this X patch to see if Blizzard's retroactively updated that version. Sadly, what you get on Pro is still running at 1920 by 1080 for gameplay. You get the 4K HUD and nothing else there. A close comparison between the two enhanced consoles in the training area bears that divide in image quality out, and it's a huge win for X hardware. Now in terms of visual settings, PS4 Pro brought a neat extra to the table. This came in the form of texture filtering, which cleared up the presentation of surfaces at tight angles next to a base PS4. For Xbox One X users, this 4K patch upgrades texture filtering to match PC's best preset. It gives what appears to be that same 16 times setting and visibly clears up the appearance of textures even compared to PS4 Pro. Beyond this, you're broadly getting the same package as PS4.
Looking at. Well, in terms of image quality, it's immediately clear to see that Xbox One X has a huge advantage here. We're looking at 1800p on Microsoft's platform, which gives us an image that works very well on a 4K screen. There's a significant boost in clarity compared to PlayStation 4 Pro, resolving more fine details and adding more refinements to elements of the post-processing pipeline, such as the film grain and motion blur. It's not exactly a sharp presentation, but I feel that this softer, filmic look actually works rather well, and the boost in resolution to 1800p is certainly noticeable. Meanwhile, in terms of PlayStation 4 Pro, the situation is somewhat more interesting. The patch notes state that the game is running at 1260p, but from our captures with the machine set to 4K output, we are actually seeing a native 1080p image here, with elements such as the HUD also being visibly upscaled. Whereas on Xbox One X, the HUD elements are all rendered natively at 4K, which is not the case for PS4 Pro, where multiple elements all appear to be running at 1080p, the game and the HUD. In terms of the core artwork and special effects, both Pro and Xbox One X are mostly a match here.
Looking pretty decent, though not optimal.
4K 30 mode though, looks pretty good from my perspective.
Yeah, clearly there's enough headroom, and the fact that it's running between 1800p and 4K to get to 30 FPS look, that's a pretty good deal, I think. And bear in mind, there's no checkerboarding to be seen here, which brings us on to the PS4 Pro comparisons, because obviously PS4 Pro, the patch came out way in advance of this one, and they had a checkerboarded 4K. It gives a decent impression of 4K and looks great on 4K sets, whereas Xbox One X is trying to gun for the real thing, and clearly performance isn't an issue there.
Yeah, it's an interesting choice of priorities there, because that 3840 by 2160 checkerboard on the Pro is locked, right? There's no dynamic scaling there.
That seems to be the case, yeah. It was always gunning for a 4K checkerboard.
But on the flip side, the Xbox One X does have native resolution, but it is using dynamic scaling, which I find fascinating.
There's not much to really divide the two versions. You get all the enhancements that Pro got in the first place. The ambient occlusion appears to be of the same quality. Texture filtering same again. There is a difference in shadow quality though that bears mention. Definitely Xbox One X gets sharper shadows, clearer in the distance mainly, but generally these two worlds look roughly the same in terms of the general settings. It's just the resolution that's the main divider. Looking at both, I think the Xbox One X does win out overall, but it's not an exact comparison because there's clearly something more going over above the actual raw pixel count these two machines are pushing out.
And I think that's good news overall, because essentially both versions of the game are getting excellent implementations worthy of a 4K panel.
Perhaps the biggest advantage though Xbox One X has over PS4 Pro, and despite it running at a technically higher native resolution, is in performance. Now, as you remember, PS4 Pro does struggle to hold 30 FPS at all times. It even fell below the standard of the base PS4 when it came to areas like Crookbag Bog. So if we throw both machines at that area, you're clearly seeing a big divide between the two. Despite the resolution differences, Xbox One X seems to be winning on both fronts, image quality and performance, which is a real feat.
Well, let's find out what we're looking at. First up, all important image quality, and this is one area where Xbox One X has a considerable lead over PS4 Pro. On Pro we're looking at 1440p resolution that appears fairly crisp, but at the same time it's not high enough to get us close to imitating a native 4K resolution. It's better than base hardware, but at the same time if you want to get 1:1 pixel sharpness, then you'll need to play the game on a 1080p screen. However, on Xbox One X, the resolution gets a boost up to 1800p, and it's a considerable upgrade. While it's not native 4K, I feel that from general viewing distances of a couple of feet away, then the differences are going to be less pronounced than you might think. The image on Xbox One X appears crisp and sharp, with plenty of detail, and upscaling artifacts aren't really noticeable. There's a sense that the picture isn't as razor sharp as with the native 4K presentation, but it still looks great, and more importantly, it delivers a nice upgrade over playing the game on a 1080p screen, which is exactly what you'd want from an Xbox One X upgrade. Image quality is also improved via tweaks to the temporal anti-aliasing algorithm, which means that there's slightly less ghosting in motion on Xbox One X than on PS4 Pro. It's not something that overtly stands out, but again it just adds a little bit more refinement to the basic presentation on Microsoft's system. As you'd expect, the increased pixel count adds more clarity to the entire scene, whether that be texture details or distant scenery made up of smaller subpixel elements. But resolution is just one part of the extensive upgrade seen on Xbox One X. For example, the core assets are increased in quality here. High resolution textures are deployed across the terrain, adding a lot more detail, whether that be across the ground or across the various rock surfaces throughout the game. There's a sense that we're getting more high frequency information and better clarity as a result of this upgrade in artwork, and it makes a pretty big difference. This is particularly noticeable when looking at the ground details. Things such as puddles, tyre tracks and footprints all have better definition due to the new higher resolution ground decals. And it shows that Ubisoft are serious about taking advantage of the increase in pixel count by providing high quality assets that really shine when shown at higher resolutions. Texture filtering is also improved as well. The high level of anisotropic filtering here means that these details across the ground appear clearer at a distance. It's not a massive difference at first, but if you look closely you can see that Xbox One X definitely has a nice little advantage here when you combine all the different elements together. So far, the increase in resolution and high quality assets are probably the most distinctive improvements on Xbox One X, but Ubisoft does go a step further. Geometry detail also appears more complex across the game via increased use of tessellation. You can notice this across the entire scene, from the bumps in the ground being more pronounced, to the various rock surfaces appearing smoother and slightly better defined. When looking at the rocks, you'll also notice some tweaks to what looks like ambient occlusion there. It could be just that the shadows are placed at slightly different points due to dynamic time of day, but there's a sense that the surrounding details feature more depth and three-dimensionality on Xbox One X compared to PS4 Pro. All of this helps to create a richer appearance for this beautiful open world environment, and there's also slightly more consistency when exploring it as well. While draw distances are essentially identical with regards to the number of objects populating distant scenery, the actual level of detail transitions are actually drawn further out on Xbox One X. And to that extent there's also less pop-in in terms of mid-scene details compared to PS4 Pro.
At last, we have PC's top grade textures on console. Put into example, ground textures get a clear resolution bump from the soup-like results on Pro to a sharper, clearer asset on Xbox One X. It's something I'd hope to see on the standard PS4 and Xbox One, given the inconsistency of textures across those versions. On a 4K set, it's an essential addition to the package though. With the higher pixel counts on PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, it's something of a necessity, and one entirely missing on Sony's console. And as it happens, it's one of the most substantial upgrades I've seen in a comparison of the two machines so far. It's worth noting Xbox One X has a familiar visual settings menu to PS4 Pro, though with one extra I'll cover in a minute. Here, you get a quality mode that prioritizes better visual settings like draw distance, but also a resolution mode that prioritizes a native 4K image. More on the actual numbers in a second, but it's worth pointing out you get better textures than PS4 Pro regardless of which mode you choose. On quality mode, you get the best asset possible on Xbox One X, while the resolution mode uses lower quality texture filtering, blurring the ground slightly despite using the same texture setting. Compared to PS4 Pro's texture work on its quality mode, which is the same as resolution mode, these still both trump it in sheer clarity though. It's a huge difference. Subtle as it may be, it's evident Microsoft's machine does get even better draw distance settings overall on mountainside geometry and small objects, over and above PS4 Pro's existing enhancements. It's a small improvement, nothing on the scale of the texture upgrades, but another advantage that shows Xbox One X veering close to PC's best presets. There will be more in-depth visual comparisons down the line, including PC, once I have the final code to hand, but between the high grade textures and pushed out level of detail settings, it's a respectable upgrade over PS4 Pro, and it doesn't stop there. Comparing PS4 Pro's 4.2 teraflop GPU to Xbox One X's 6 teraflop chip qualifies it for a crucial upgrade in native resolution, bringing it much closer to a true 4K.